So thank you very much for the warm welcome. And thank you so much to Victor, Samudu, Eva, and the rest of the Psychedelics Europe team for inviting us to speak here and to talk a bit about psychedelics and reimbursement. I'm Floris Wolswijk. I'm a psychologist by study, but actually 15 years ago, I learned nothing about psychedelics. The history was actually forgotten at the time. So I wanted to remedy that, and for that I started Blossom, which tracks, maps, and helps explain psychedelic research, and has mapped out and put on summaries for over 2,000 psychedelic research papers. Most of the information is freely available. Next to that, I've been sort of making that bridge from that research to seeing actually how can we bring that into practice. Part of the work has been with Delphi, a US-based consultancy, where I've had a front row seat of seeing how they're maybe one step ahead of Europe, but maybe not much longer, and really seeing how we can also step outside of our psychedelic bubble, which I think is also happening today. How we can interface with healthcare, with finance, maybe most importantly also with government. So today we'll be talking a bit about that implementation gap, because there's a big clinical promise, but we still need to go over that to actually see psychedelics be implemented in the real world. I think psychedelics are something that is relatively new, at least new for healthcare systems, but maybe not new, as Thomas was already saying, for clinical care that has already happened in the past. I was going to tell a story about some research in the past, but one thing I didn't hear during the discussion of the research, so I want to make it a bit interactive, so be prepared, is how much research has actually already happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s here in the Czech Republic. So by show of hands, who thinks less than 100 sessions have taken place here in the Czech Republic?
Ano, to jsem odpovídala.
Okay. Less than 1,000. Less than 10,000. See some hands. And more than 10,000. Okay, maybe there's a bit of a translation barrier for show of hands, but people, you were actually, at least by the percentage of hands, in the right direction. So there were about 9,000 sessions that took place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s with about 1,100 patients. So actually you already have some experience. But doing a mental health and a drug treatment together is something that's very challenging for health systems all around the world. So what's happening in Europe and what do we need to do here? The next slide. So Martin and I met at ICPR. It's a research-focused conference on psychedelics. And there we really were also talking about that reimbursement gap. So for 6 months, we looked at this under a project grant from Norsk Mind, a Swedish nonprofit, where we looked at how can psychedelics become reimbursed care. We didn't do this alone. Josh Hartman was one of the co-authors, one of the people that helped us, and Victor and Samudu, and today's Howard from Perea. And there we really wanted to discover what has been happening in Europe, but also what still needs to happen. The report is freely available, and we'll share a link to it on the last slide. So what did we set out to do with this report? We wanted to map out what needs to happen in terms of the reimbursement, and not only in terms of clinical trials, that we know a lot about that already, but also how does it look like to go from after a clinical trial towards that reimbursement itself. And for the countries we looked at, the Czech Republic was one of the case studies next to Germany, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. We want to identify both the challenges, but also opportunities and potential solutions. I think our report is about 80% challenges, but today I think we want to balance it more and also talk a bit more about those opportunities, and Martin will do that in a few minutes. It isn't just what we could find out or what the information that I've gathered over the last 7 years, but really it's an engagement with stakeholders. So we had about 24 interviews with stakeholders all across Europe, including the Czech Republic. And we also had input from about 24 more in terms of questions that the different stakeholders had. And those stakeholders are patient representatives, drug developers, but also insurance companies, people working on that evaluation of novel healthcare solutions. So really having a broad scala of different stakeholders all across Europe. All with the goal of facilitating access to psychedelic therapies and offering strategies how we can do that. Maybe also to highlight that in a report, like only one strategy is really going through the normal healthcare system, sort of going through the normal pathways, but we have 9 more small variations or large variations on that are possible. So do encourage people to check that out. But before we go into some of those solutions, first some hurdles that might be there. And this is a big slide with a lot of information on here, and I won't go through all of it. And the report there's even more. But there's a lot of challenges that we still have to go through, or things we have to think about before psychedelics can become reimbursed care. Here in the economic hurdles, one challenge is that higher upfront cost. You have a drug that might cost a lot more than it would cost for recreational use. But also a lot of therapy. In the MAPS MDMA model, there's about 100 hours of therapy time for one treatment. And that's way more than you have now in a current CBT model or another mental health treatment. So can we justify those costs? Can we say there's a bigger efficacy? And can we also tell insurance that something like that is worth it to do it? So we also still need to generate more of that data. And what's the infrastructure that we need for psychedelic treatments? Who needs to be there, and how much therapy needs to be there? And can it be, or does it need to be, a psychiatrist, which I think now is also in the law that passed the lower house here in the Czech Republic. Does that psychiatrist, which is a relatively expensive, or maybe one of the most expensive healthcare professionals, does he or she need to be there the whole time, or can there also be a psychologist or a nurse or someone else that can do the treatment or can do part of that treatment? So we still need to answer those questions and see who needs to be where, but also how do we train them, right? So who can be there, and what of the training do we need to do now already before those phase 3 studies are there and are approved? And maybe that takes me to the last thing I'll highlight here, is those evidence challenges. There's amazing, promising results, and we saw some of the statistics here today. But a lot of that is in phase 2 trials, and we don't have that many phase 3 studies yet, and also not that many studies that have been done here, specifically in Europe. So we also have some of that evidence gap that we need to overcome. So to map it out more visually, even after an EMA market authorization or a local authorization on the country level, there's still a lot that needs to happen. So there's still many more steps that need to happen after the clinical approval. We need to do a lot of things in terms of the regulatory side, which of course you've taken an amazing, a huge step in already. But then there's the infrastructure, the providers, the reimbursement. So there's a lot that needs to happen. And I think we really have to be pragmatic here. We can't have perfect be the enemy of good, and there needs to be a lot of flexibility, both on the side of how psychedelic treatments can be implemented, but also on the side of the healthcare system. Because there is a big promise, but there's still a lot of barriers to actually implementing this. So the last slide I'll present is really looking at how can we make psychedelics become accessible care. I think it's now sort of a big promise versus a big challenge. And we can maybe see psychedelics as a square peg that needs to go into a round hole. Psychedelic treatments are now more expensive than other mental health treatments. And for instance, on the authorization side, the EMA isn't really being that clear. On the infrastructure, we really don't have too much clarity, or a lot of the infrastructure in a lot of countries just isn't there yet for psychedelic treatments. So we still need to overcome that. But I think if psychedelics teach us anything, is that things can change. So hopefully we can change things on both sides so we have a better fit together. Maybe we can implement group therapy or make other changes to the treatment with psychedelics. And on the authorization and evaluation side, we do see some engagement already, and of course the EMA already doing a workshop last year. So there are some initial positive signs. And on that infrastructure, we have started training therapists all around Europe for this. And there are clinics who are preparing, and you see here in the Czech Republic already working with ketamine. So I think we can get there. But before I get carried away with things that we can do, I'll give the word to Martin.
Thank you, Floris. Floris did an excellent job in summarizing some of those challenges. My personal experience is bringing medicines with regulatory approval into country reimbursement systems, and we have a lot of challenges. So it's nice to talk about some of the solutions, some of the activities that we might want to focus on to improve the likelihood of a positive reimbursement decision and local access for as many as patients who are in need. Okay, so the first area which would benefit from some focus, or where we'd increase the likelihood of reimbursement in the future, is focusing on strengthening the evidence. And this isn't talking about necessarily the evidence required for a regulatory approval. It's around what is the evidence that's required to make a reimbursement decision. And that means that we need to create an environment where drug developers wish to engage with country regulators and health technology assessment bodies on what are the trial designs and the evidence package that they need to provide to be able to have those decisions made. And that's going to include very much a focus on comparative value, because it's tricky to run the studies, but what are the local standards of care which need to be assessed, or which the new therapy needs to be assessed against, and also incorporating in the evidence package long-term outcomes, whether that be for the patient, for the health system, indirect benefits to society. And the HTA bodies in turn can play their part in helping facilitate a clearer pathway, and that will include looking at their methodology for how they assess drugs for reimbursement. It's very different in every country, and it would benefit from being looked at now, not at the point of a regulatory approval, so that developers understand the pathway which they need to be taking and what they need to provide for those decisions to be made. Throughout the report, we heard time and time again from our contributors talking about the value of real-world evidence. This is in addition to clinical trial work, which is happening just now. But instead of just doing more and more clinical trials, there comes a point where actually the real-world evidence is going to be more valuable for understanding the value in the local healthcare system and create an environment where real-world evidence can be collected and analyzed is extremely important. To do this, countries will need to think about creating an environment where conditional reimbursement or managed entry programs are available for psychedelics, so that real-world evidence can be collected up, and then a decision about reimbursement and access for patients can be made afterwards. And beyond the evidence, there's a need to plan in advance for the local access situation. We heard a lot today about different models of care and what's the right model of care, but it needs to be thought about now around creating dedicated therapy rooms and how many might be needed, accredited training programs for those who are supporting patients, and also clinical protocols. A clinical protocol that can be implemented locally and is also scalable and suitable across the individual country. Payers will need to think about, is there a better way to facilitate payment of these treatments to providers, including maybe bundled treatment or bundled payments where there's drug and therapy costs bundled together rather than looking for separate reimbursement pieces from insurers. And also there's probably going to be a need to look at outcome-based agreements where some of that risk on what the outcome will be for the patient and the healthcare system is shared up front. That also means providers with good care protocols will be rewarded well for their work. We also need to foster, wherever possible, multidisciplinary dialogue. Of course, there's a lot today in evidence, but need to think about that dialogue and looking all the way through that access pathway, and only through having multi-stakeholder discussions can practical solutions be made for where we see some of those hurdles today. You may be interested to know what reimbursement of psychedelics today looks like in the Czech Republic versus other countries. We looked at Germany, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom. Of course, there's only a few therapies we can look at today. We were looking at ketamine access and also esketamine access, and not trial access. We were talking about real-world access for patients in the health system. And esketamine has a reimbursement status, which is a positive reimbursement status in Germany and the Netherlands, although the evidence for its use is still quite limited use. And in the United Kingdom, there's actually no positive, well, it was a negative reimbursement decision made on esketamine, and it's very difficult to get any access in the UK. Now, it's the same data set, so why are the differences? It's around how those countries assess those drugs and make reimbursement decisions, and they're all very different. And Germany will make a decision to reimburse all regulatory approved products early, like almost immediately, and then they will look at pricing based on the clinical benefit. The Netherlands will take a health economic approach. They'll look at cost effectiveness. They also incorporate some of those indirect benefits which we talked about, which is really important in mental health conditions. The United Kingdom also takes a cost effectiveness approach, but very rigid thresholds for what meets cost effectiveness. And if you don't meet them, you're almost blocked out of the market, as esketamine is. So how does that compare for the Czech Republic today? Well, we heard a lot today around access in clinical trials. Access in the real world is still a positive story, even though there's limited access. You know, we learnt about levels of access for ketamine over the last few years and reimbursement from insurers. And also there was a positive national reimbursement listing for esketamine in late 2024. You know, so these are positive developments. It shows that the Czech system is adapting and meeting some of the challenge around these novel mental health treatments. And on top of that, there's other benefits. There's other strengths that we learnt about from the Czech system, and that's around the very active research community, also an emerging ketamine clinic network for either private pay or through insurer reimbursement or part reimbursement. And also we learnt of a number of examples of real-world evidence projects where those are funded treatment and collecting real-world evidence. So there's some real opportunities for leadership in countries, and Czech Republic could certainly be one of those based on this positive base. And some of these areas to potentially be a leader on when it comes to access and reimbursement is around piloting innovative reimbursement models for psychedelics, as we talked about trialing things like bundled payment approaches, and also trialing risk-sharing approaches. There's a need and an opportunity to invest early in some of the training infrastructure and dedicated facilities. We also see an opportunity, but it's very much a need for the HTA methodology to be reviewed and check, is it fit for purpose for psychedelics? Because they have, a non-standard evidence set, and clinical studies have to be done in a different way to other therapies. And that HTA methodology creates a clear pathway for developers to see the pathway forward and to commit to come into the Czech Republic early, rather than later when they're looking to make their medicine or therapy available. And on the theme of the pathway, it's also important that there's a clear and efficient rescheduling process as well that they can see will happen post-regulatory approval. We talked a lot about evidence today, and different people have talked about it in a different way. But one of the things which is an opportunity is, early adopters, and at a country level, early adopters that collect real-world evidence are really going to have a view ahead of other European countries around the value of these treatments. And also collecting real-world evidence in the country allows you to conduct further analysis, such as cost-effectiveness analysis, of which there's very little in Europe today. So any of this data today is very valuable for supporting future reimbursement evaluations and decisions. And we can't stress again how much we heard time and time again about the need for it to be multi-stakeholder discussions. So that's either supporting ones which exist or supporting the expansion of those and looking all the way along that pathway from regulatory approval to implementation in the clinic to look at those hurdles and come up with those solutions. And doing it now, or in the near future, and not waiting for a regulatory approval for a new innovative psychedelic. So with that, it was a very rapid review of some of those potential activities to demonstrate further leadership in the Czech Republic. We certainly conclude by saying that psychedelic therapies represent a potential paradigm shift for treating challenging conditions, including depression, PTSD, and addictions. And we certainly feel from our work over the last 6 months that the Czech Republic has clear potential to become a European model for responsible and equitable access for patients. As Floris mentioned, there is a report if you want to dive deeper into this. It's available online, it's free to access, and thank you very much for your time.